Okay, so picture this. It's November 2002. I'm a junior in high school, and I'm on Thanksgiving break. My brother is in college and is also home on his Thanksgiving break. What else happens in November of 2002? One of the best games on the GameCube is released, Metroid Prime. So my brother bought the game and brought it home for Thanksgiving. We both got really into it and were immediately hooked. I recall quite vividly on one particular day, I think it was the day before the actual Thanksgiving holiday, I left sometime in the morning and my brother was playing Metroid Prime when I left. I came back like 6 to 8 hours later and he was still playing it. I asked, "Have you been playing this all day?" "Yeah." Today I'm examining Metroid Prime Remastered on the Nintendo Switch. It came out in February 2023, only a few months shy of the 20th anniversary of the original game's release. I've had this copy for more than a year, and I've finally been fortunate enough to check it off my backlog. I can wax poetic for several paragraphs about Metroid Prime, but I'm going to cut to the crux of my thesis. Metroid Prime is a perfect video game. This is a label that I think is applicable to a relative handful of titles over the course of gaming history. And let me elaborate more on this. So obviously no game is objectively perfect. No piece of art is perfect. Every video game or movie or album will be subjectively judged based on personal taste and preferences, regardless of how objectively amazing the graphics are, or how tight the controls are, or how well the game plays. But what is a perfect video game? And why do I say this about Metroid Prime specifically? So I base this argument on a definition of perfect that I recently learned through a couple of bits of media. The first was from film production company and famous YouTube channel Red Letter Media. Some time ago, I had stumbled upon their 2016 episode of Review, one of their various shows they put on, and it was about Tremors, that 1990 gem of a film starring Kevin Bacon about prehistoric slug monsters who emerge from the ground in the desert and eat people. It's a real classic. One of the hosts of the show, Mike Stoklasa, called the film a perfect movie.
I've rewatched it. It holds up almost 100% except for one shot. Tremors is like a Ghostbusters level film where it achieves near perfection in every aspect of it. It's a hokey monster movie. It's a throwback kind of monster movie, but it is perfect in its execution, creativity,
screenplay, structure.
The screenplay is flawless, and that's what I think that's a big thing for me because I'm a structure guy.
Yeah.
And there are other movies that I will enjoy that are completely structureless and just weird, but this movie is perfect.
The second was from Jeremy Parrish of Retronauts, a podcast I've listened to for years and I support on Patreon. In a recent episode about ranking the classic Castlevania games, Jeremy referred to the original Castlevania on the NES as a perfect video game.
I would put this in the same category as a handful of other games like Ms. Pac-Man, Galaga, Tetris, that is just like, this game is perfect for the level of technology it has, for the time that it came out, and for what it sets out to do. Like, this, sets out to be a 6-stage action game, kind of in the Ghost and Goblins vein, with a sort of ooky spooky horror movie kind of referentialism to it. And it does all of those things perfectly. It's not the best Castlevania game. It's not the deepest Castlevania game for sure. But, within the sort of limited boundaries of what its creators wanted to do to create, I can't really see this game doing that any better. So you can add to this game, you can give it new mechanics, you can make it adventuresome, whatever. But if you just want this tightly crafted, perfectly controlling, thoughtfully balanced, challenging but not impossible, little compact action game, this is it. This is the one.
And that sums it up. What makes Tremors and Castlevania perfect, at least according to Mike and Jeremy, is that both properties set out to deliver a specific vision, and they both accomplish every aspect of that vision. And, in my humble opinion, so does Metroid Prime. The game sets a clear vision of what it wants to be and crushes it in every aspect. I think to judge Prime also requires examining the game in the context of its predecessors, in particular the incredible Super Metroid on the Super Nintendo. Personally, I never had much of a history with Metroid prior to Prime's release. I read about the Metroid games in gaming magazines like Electronic Gaming Monthly, and it always intrigued me. However, my first real exposure to the series was probably when I played Super Metroid on an emulator at the turn of the millennium. I recall being captivated by the game's quiet, brooding mood, and its narrative driven more by context clues rather than text boxes. Super Metroid delivered an incredible atmosphere as you play as Samus Aran, navigating an interconnected maze on an alien world. I mean, you don't need me to tell you how incredible this game is. It's been referenced and lauded by so many other developers and aped by companies like Konami, who used it in later versions of Castlevania. It's where we get the term Metroidvania. When Nintendo unveiled the GameCube in 2000, the company showcased Metroid as one of the franchises coming to the new system. Admittedly, it was just an FMV trailer, but it still signaled that this once dormant franchise would return after having sat out the Nintendo 64 entirely. However, there were questions on how this would all work. There was trepidation at the time, both in the press and in the general gaming public to my recollection, on how a new Metroid, a game series that worked masterfully in 2D, could make the jump to the third dimension. Following the GameCube's launch in 2001, Nintendo began illuminating further on how this would work, announcing that Metroid Prime would not only take place in a fully 3D world, but would also be a first-person game. Now, if my memory serves me correctly, this was received at the time with interest but also concern. A first-person Metroid? How will they be able to make this kind of game while continuing the formula of an immersive, interconnected open world? How would stuff like jumping work? How would the morph ball work? Will there be some sort of third-person option? These questions were all valid. Even with my limited experience with Metroid, I remember having similar thoughts. Fast forward to November 18th, 2002, and Metroid Prime is released. And it was an immediate critical hit. It scored high across the gaming press. I remember Electronic Gaming Monthly, I think, gave it a perfect 10. They would never rate games like that, ever. It was incredibly rare to give it 10s across the board, and they did that for Metroid Prime. According to VG charts, Metroid Prime sold more than 2.8 million copies as of 2014. A respectable figure for the entry of a series that had been on hiatus for 8 years, for a console that barely cracked 20 million units sold. And while it had a hardcore audience, the GameCube was generally still catered to children. What an awesome comeback for what was then an overlooked series. So, back to my perfection argument. What makes Metroid Prime so incredible can be summed up in one word: atmosphere. After you launch the game and sit through a few opening logos, you encounter a black screen accompanied with creepy sounds that I think are supposed to resemble a computer or something like that. Those first few seconds give away to what appears to be microorganisms, and from there you're greeted with the title screen. And the music here, man is it awesome. The opening tune on the title screen is essentially a revised modern update of the title screen music from the Metroid on the original NES, as well as Super Metroid on the Super Nintendo. So, from the title screen to the opening derelict spaceship level, to the landing on Talon 4, to traveling from the launch site to Phendrana Drifts, to Magmore Caverns, and so on and so forth. The game's atmosphere always delivers a feeling of solitude, while also paradoxically delivering an environment that feels full of life. You encounter enemies all over the place, but they often exist almost as creatures in their own environment rather than enemies that are trying to thwart you. It's as if we're invading their space and they're minding their own business until some lady in an armored suit shows up and shoots them. At the same time, you feel completely alone in this alien world. You travel through a maze of corridors and caverns that display hints that there was some sort of civilization on this world that is no longer present. In true Metroidvania fashion, you come to areas that you cannot reach yet until you get the appropriate power-ups like the Morph Ball or the Grapple Beam. Also, for a game that doesn't technically have enormous open environments, the art direction and graphical fidelity often give you a feeling that you're in a space that's much grander, like in these skyboxes or in these open hub areas that you encounter. And the music, I mean, it's awesome. Of course I'm going to say that. I think it's equally as important as the art style in terms of delivering on the game's atmosphere. So how does it all play? Well, admittedly, the GameCube original had fairly unorthodox controls, even for the time. Halo was already a year old at this point, and that game had popularized and standardized on consoles the traditional twin-stick model, controlling the body with one stick and the camera with the other. The original Metroid Prime on the GameCube, perhaps in typical Nintendo fashion, bucked this trend by instead sticking to the old-school model that we found in games like GoldenEye on the Nintendo 64, of having the left stick control forward and back movements of Samus as well as turning left and right. The C-stick was used for other camera movements, namely up and down. But in streamlining this experience, Retro Studios adjusted for this control scheme by creating a specific lock-on system mapped to the left trigger. So basically, you would see an enemy in your sights, you'd hold down the left trigger, lock onto them, and then use the right trigger to shoot them. This made it easier because you would lock onto enemies and then strafe around them and fire at them. This is, in my opinion, one of the reasons the game is called a first-person adventure game rather than a first-person shooter. The shooting is, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but in general it's an afterthought. And, I'm okay with that. I mean, of course I'm going to say that. But Retro Studios set out on crafting a unique first-person game that, while it might not be to everyone's taste, is executed incredibly well. They had a vision and made it happen. Again, perfectly, in my humble opinion. Okay, so Metroid Prime Remastered, which came out in 2023, reincorporates traditional first-person shooter controls that we're all used to. I love the original game, but I'm not a purist. In my recent playthrough, I stuck with the updated controls for convenience. I also do not think going this route takes away from the overall experience. In terms of shooting, locking onto enemies is still the primary combat method, and it feels just as good as ever in the remaster. One final area I want to really highlight is the story, specifically the way it is conveyed. To sum it up, there's no dialogue throughout the game. Everything is explained through visuals, or text boxes from scans, or the information database on the pause menu. And I love this. Sometimes I think developers felt at the time, and still feel now, the pressure to really push a cinematic narrative in games for the sake of appealing to modern expectations. And the main way to achieve that is by creating cutscenes and incorporating spoken dialogue. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, and nothing against the gaming creatives for wanting to tell a story with that filmic bent. But I think in many cases, this is done to the detriment of a game's narrative. Maybe it's just me, and maybe I'm just getting older, but more often than not, I just get bored and tired sitting through gaming cutscenes. There are more creative ways to tell a story, even in first-person shooter games. So, as for Metroid Prime, there is still a story told through the visual cues and the text boxes, but it doesn't get in the way of the exploration and atmospheric gameplay. It doesn't diminish the importance of storytelling, but rather realigns it so that the exploration is the primary narrative method. And again, it's all of that atmosphere. So it's 20 years later, and my brother, who had the 8-hour Metroid session at the beginning of my story, is also the same person who bought me this copy of Metroid Prime Remastered sometime in 2023. I appreciated his generosity, and I'm kind of remiss to think that it took me this long to finally play it. Nostalgia is obviously a factor in my biased praise of this game, but I really think Metroid Prime holds up in such a way that other games do not. While Retro Studios was, and still is, owned by Nintendo, a company that has always had cash in its coffers, there's something sort of scrappy about the creation of Metroid Prime. This was a series that had been dormant for 8 years. It was handed to an American studio based in Texas, and that company crafted a vision for how to bring this series into 3D. I know I'm being romantic on this. I know that Nintendo developers from Japan, and Shigeru Miyamoto in particular, had a hand in bringing Metroid Prime to completion. But it still feels like a typical underdog story, the kind with a satisfying ending, where the scrappy team blew everyone away with its creation. Retro Studios set out a vision, executed, and delivered. And it was, in my opinion, perfect.